Now, folks, this is a global tax, not my opinion. The Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations, the government bureaucracies, testimony in Congress years ago. I mean, I have the testimony in my film Endgame where they're saying, yes, it's going to be a tax on all human activity, a tax on everything you do on carbon dioxide to control. This is neo-feudalism. Meanwhile, it is a cover for the real environmental crises we have. Instead of school children learning how bad cross-species genetic hybrids, part spider, part goat, pig, part human to harvest organs that gives rise to superviruses and all sorts of mutations. There are tens of thousands now, tens of thousands of cross-species creations. Plants with cockroach genes and salmon genes, salmon with corn genes. There are some cross-species creations that have more than 100 different organisms' genetics directly put in. And it's already spreading into the environment, causing all these problems in the biosphere. You've got plants being grown open air that have been genetically altered with other species' DNA jumping into other plants, directly connected in major German, Dutch, and Japanese studies to the bee die-off. They're genetically engineering pesticide into scores of crops to where the bugs can't eat it or they'll die, but then humans eat it. And they go find the dead honeybees where the whole colony dies, and they cut them open and go into them, and they have the pesticide in them that is grown in the pharmacological corn and the other crops. The little bees go and eat the pollen, and they die because most insects smell it with their olfactory centers and fly off and don't eat it. Did you know pigs won't eat most of these GMO crops? That's the real crisis. Depleted uranium being used at proving grounds all over the United States, Canada, and Europe has billions and billions a year half-life. In all the government studies, admittedly causes massive cancer. Israel just used it in Gaza. Totally insane. Blew across Israel. That's how the winds blow from west to east in the jet stream. Every time it's used, radiation detectors in England and all over the world pick it up thousands of miles away because it's particularized and it goes around the planet over and over again. Depleted uranium, cutting down the rainforest, overfishing the seas. There are real things happening that are serious. Instead, we're going to tax everything you do with carbon dioxide as a toxic waste, listing it as a dangerous pollutant that's going to kill the polar bears. The last study they did before the newest, a decade ago, showed around 35,000 polar bears in the world. Guess how many polar bears there are now? 40-plus thousand, 45,000, over 10,000 more polar bears. You can pull up the numbers. But the news knows the public is ignorant about what's happening with wildlife, and they show polar bears on ice floes, and they go, oh, look at the mommy with the baby. They can't swim. Global warming made the glacier melt. Look, glaciers are collapsing. Glaciers always, it rains, the glacier pushes out to the ocean. They're always expanding and then contracting. They're always have ice floes. It is the strongest swimmer of any land animal. They have been recorded swimming up to 300 miles. They routinely take 150-mile swims. They go out to the ice floes and hunt seal and beluga. They are so strong, one polar bear can reach in and grab a multi-thousand-pound beluga whale and drag it up on the ice and eat it with one arm. With one arm. And the news says and teaches children the polar bears are drowning because the ice caps are melting. Folks, the sun was in its brightest cycle ever recorded in several hundred years of it being documented. One of the most intensely studied phenomenon continually is the sun. Moons of Jupiter and of Saturn that had ice shelves that were frozen had now melted because the sun was so bright and putting off so much heat. The ice caps of Mars were receding by several miles a year until 2 years ago. It's the sun, not carbon dioxide. Suddenly, the moons froze again, orbiting Saturn and Jupiter, and the ice caps began exploding in size. The tiny cap on the south, the larger cap on the north of Mars. This is a incontrovertible fact. Your SUV is not making moons melt. They're oceans of methane. They are not making the water ice caps of Mars melt. The sun is doing it. The sun is causing it, not carbon dioxide on the Earth. The UN's own study admits that about 1% of the carbon dioxide on the Earth is being put out by humans. The ocean, though, is made up of carbon dioxide. Volcanoes put out more carbon dioxide, a large gaseous explosion like Mount St. Helens, than all human activity in all of recorded history. This is on record. These greenhouse gases are part of our shield from the radiation of the sun. That's why it's so dangerous for airline pilots who fly for decades above 30,000 feet, because in that 30,000 feet, there's upwards of 10 feet of water, if you condensed it down, in the atmosphere that is a shield. And so that's why it's the equivalent of getting multiple chest x-rays every time you fly during the daylight hours in an aircraft above 30,000 feet. It's the sun. It's powerful. It's massive. It is radiating. And it's so important that we explain that to people. They tell you that they have to tax and limit CO2 in the United States because the polar bears are dying and drowning and because they're threatened. That is a fraud. There are 10,000 more polar bears than there were a decade ago. Record numbers. Their populations are exploding. And archaeologists have done studies and have dug into the fossil record, and it shows that during the Hiberium maximum and other heating periods going back 10,000 years ago, that polar bear populations explode when it's warm. Polar bears lose upwards of 30% of their weight during the winter. They almost starve to death. They wait for the summer. They need the heat. It is a lie. But I told you Mars ice caps are getting bigger now. After shrinking, they predicted in 2008, Al Gore and others who owns, by the way, the carbon company you'll buy your taxes from, on record, they predicted that there would be a 30% plus shrinkage of the southern and northern ice caps, Antarctica and the Arctic. Guess what? Record increase in size. Many ports that had been used for hundreds of years that ships could enter around Canada are now closed. They're now closed. They were always open year-round. They're closed because it's ice, folks. It's ice. Because the sun 2 years ago went from like a light bulb that's about to burn out. I'm not saying the sun's about to burn out, but, it brightens and then it dims. Brightens and it dims. No sunspots. First time in history, no sunspots. What's a sunspot? You're looking straight on to a giant explosion, a Coriolis storm, a huge sun flare blasting out thousands of times the size of the Earth forward. And that radiation and heat hits us and heats the planet and brings life. The sun is cooling right now, and the solar system is becoming very, very cold. We could be entering a new ice age, and the studies show we're due for one.